Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is frequent, and this verb was suggested by the viewer Artem, and I'm really grateful for this suggestion. Now, let's take a moment and review the definition of this verb. The verb frequent really has one primary meaning, and that is to visit a place often or habitually. So we might think of this at a regular interval. For now, you should know that frequent is a regular verb. If you want to make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing, and that forms frequenting. The past tense and the participle form of our verb can be made by adding ed. Our base verb, frequent, ends in a T sound. This means when I add the ed ending, I'm going to add an extra syllable to this verb. The ed suffix is going to make an id sound. So the past tense and the participle form of our verb should sound like this: frequented, frequented. Okay, you hear that tid on the end? Now, there are no phrasal verbs that we need to study with this particular verb, so we'll move on to a little verb tense review. Today, I thought it would be good to review the present perfect and the present perfect progressive. These two verb tenses are frequently confused, and I have always had a number of students that have tried to better understand and work through the slight differences. With both of these verbs, we can describe an action that started in the past and one that continues into the present. Many times with the present perfect, we're focused on how many times a particular action has occurred. While with the present perfect progressive, we're really focused on how long the action has been continuing. So, very slight or small difference there. You should also know that the present perfect sometimes gets used to talk about completed actions that occurred at an unknown point in the past tense. So that can be another thing that makes them just a little bit different. But let's talk about making affirmative or positive sentences in the present perfect. This is a verb tense where we're going to need to pay attention to our subject. If the subject is I, you, we, or they, use have and then the participle form of our verb. But if the subject is he, she, or it, you'll use has and then the participle form of a verb. Let's take a look at an example sentence. Despite his well-documented record of hate speech, prominent journalists have frequented his podcast. So here, this sentence is describing this repeated action, really, that people keep going to speak with this particular person, even though this individual has a rather disturbing history of saying incredibly hateful things and maybe using language that incites others to speak in a hateful way or do horrible things to other groups of people. Now let's take a look at a negative present perfect sentence. To do this, again, pay attention to your subject, use have or has as appropriate, and then use not, and then the participle form the verb. Here's another example. She hasn't frequented her favorite restaurants since her treatment weakened her immune system. So here we have somebody who's maybe undergoing a rather serious uh, medical treatment for a particular illness. That treatment is causing her to be very susceptible to catching communicable diseases, so she is not habitually visiting this favorite restaurant. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the present perfect. To do this, we start with have or has, whatever form matches our subject, that subject comes next, and then you'll use the participle form of a verb. Here's our last present perfect example. Have you frequented the city's many library branches? Right? So this is someone who wants to know, not just do you go to one particular location, but are you visiting the various locations regularly? Now, let's move on and talk a little bit about the present perfect progressive. You'll see in my notes here that this verb tense also gets called the present perfect continuous, and it's fine to use either name. We're still talking about the same thing. You've heard me talk a little bit about the differences between present perfect and present perfect progressive. I'll also point out one of my little tricks to help remember the difference. So you'll see present perfect, two P's there. And hopefully you notice that pattern of using either have or has and then the participle form of the verb. So there were two parts to our verb in the present perfect. Well, in the present perfect progressive, we have three letter P's, and that means we'll need three parts to make our verb. So again, we're going to start with the subject. We'll use have or has, depending on what that subject is. Then we'll use the participle been, B-E-E-N, and then the ing form of the verb. Let's take a look at an affirmative example. A grizzly bear has been frequenting the campground for the past week, according to park rangers. So here you can see this. We've got an action started in the past, continues into the present, and the sentence is focused on how long this action has been ongoing for the last week, right? So they might want people to be rather aware, make sure they're not leaving food that could easily attract the bear back to the campground. Now let's look at making a negative present perfect progressive sentence. Again, start with your subject, use have or has, depending on what that subject is, then use not, then the participle been, and then the ing form the verb. Here's another example. This event is a great way for people to become exposed to businesses that they haven't been frequenting. So here, someone maybe was trying to attract someone to come to a particular thing so that you get to know places maybe you haven't ever visited or ones that you don't visit regularly. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the present perfect progressive. Our pattern here is to start with either have or has, whichever form matches our subject. That subject comes next, then the participle been, and then the ing form the verb. Here's another example. Has the man been frequenting private classrooms and events on campus this semester? This particular question was being used to try and assess kind of maybe were people in sort of uncomfortable or even potentially dangerous situations. So someone who wasn't a student, wasn't an employee of the university, and trying to understand where this person is going and how often that particular action is ongoing. Now, let's spend a moment looking at some words that are related to our verb frequent. And the first word we'll start with today is the adjective form of this word. The adjective frequent has the exact same spelling and the exact same pronunciation as our verb. Now, this adjective can have a couple different meanings. One way to use this adjective is to describe a noun or describe a thing that is occurring or done on many occasions or in many cases or in quick succession. So, an example of that. There have been frequent changes in the company's policies. So, maybe this is happening, new policy in week 1, new policy in week 2, and again and again. And then a second way to use that adjective frequent is to just describe the action of doing something often or habitually. An example of this. Are you a frequent viewer of the Verb of the Day videos? I know I have many loyal viewers, and I'm so incredibly grateful and kind of astonished by that many days. But it's very much appreciated. Another related word you might encounter is the adverb frequently. So now we're describing either an adjective or a verb, something done regularly or habitually. An example of this. I make errors frequently. I wish it wasn't true, but it is, right? So here, frequently is describing the verb make. And one more word for us to discuss today. It's the noun form of our word. We've got a spelling change here. We're going to end with a CY, and we pronounce this word frequency. This noun can have a number of different meanings. I think, tried to just focus on two. So, one way you'll hear it used is the rate at which something occurs or is repeated over a particular period of time or in a given sample. An example of this: the DC collision has led to many people examining the frequency of close calls. There's a really horrific uh, collision, right, kind of crash between an airliner and helicopter last week around Washington, D.C. Horrible, terrible story, but it has made people a little more reflective of, well, how often are kind of two aircraft in close proximity or just barely missing one another in the air. Now, a second way you might hear frequency used is more in connection to radio stations. So it has to do with the wave band at which a radio station or another system broadcasts or transmits signals. An example of this might be: is that station on an FM or AM frequency? So, talking about, again, the different wave bands that uh, music and other programming is broadcasted. Thanks again to Artem for suggesting today's verb, and I thank you all for watching. Have a great day.